Hello all out there in YouTube. I know I'm not in my typical setting. You'll have to forgive me. It's been a very busy week. I've been watching a lot of dogs, and I didn't really have time to do a proper movie review. But I still wanted to get a video out to you people, so I thought of this idea that could be kind of fun. We, as horror fans, all remember when we were first getting into the genre, we would ask people to recommend us horror movies, recommend us some good, scary flicks. And after we developed our repertoire of horror movies and developed our repertoire as horror fans, we have people come up to us asking us to recommend them some horror movies. So I thought it would be fun to do a list of the 10 horror movies that I recommend to new horror fans. Now, this isn't a top 10 list. These movies aren't in any particular order. They're just 10 movies that pop into my head when a newcomer to horror asks me to recommend them some movies. And I'm not saying that these are the end-all, be-all, best, absolute, definite horror films for newcomers. No, these are just movies that pop into my head. And I want to get one quick thing out of the way before we continue. Usually when a new horror fan asks me to recommend them some movies, I don't really go to the big franchises, you know, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Child's Play, and the reason I don't recommend those movies is because I don't need to recommend those movies. The same thing goes for, like, the big classics, like The Exorcist, Jaws, and The Shining. When we were first getting into the genre, those are the movies we went to. You know, those are the movies we all started out with. And whether you're an old horror fan or a new horror fan, you know who Freddy Krueger is, you know who Michael Myers is, you know who Jason Voorhees is. So I don't really see a need to recommend those movies to a new horror fan because they've either already seen them or they're going to see them regardless of whether I recommend them or not. So after that explanation, let's get started, shall we? And please forgive me, I didn't take any notes for this, I'm just kind of doing it on the fly. The most I have is this little handy piece of paper with my choices on it. The first horror movie that pops into my head to recommend to new horror fans, and this is going to be an odd one, Christine. Now hear me out. Yes, Christine is the first movie that pops into my head for new horror fans. And this one's usually for, like, brand new horror fans. People who have only seen a handful of horror movies. They haven't really seen the really gory stuff yet. So I think that this is a good movie to start with. And that's because Christine, it has the creepy imagery, but the violence is usually more suggested, or when the violence is on screen, it's not that bloody. It still has the creepy ideas and the creepy imagery, you know, like when that car is barreling down the road on fire after that guy. So you still have the creep factor there. And I also like how Christine shows that in horror you can have a ridiculous idea. I mean, it's about a car that's alive and can reform itself after it's been destroyed. It can show how you can have a ridiculous idea, but still make a good, creepy, atmospheric movie if you do it right. You know, I've always met people who, they hear about this movie and they say, oh, that's just goofy, I'm not going to check it out, and they miss out on some legitimately good movies. You know, either you'll have the ridiculous idea and they will handle it really well and make a good, creepy movie, like Christine, or they'll take the ridiculous idea and they'll have fun with it and make an entertaining movie, like The Stuff. I also like how, usually when there's a movie that's an adaptation of a Stephen King story, it feels like a Stephen King movie, you know, regardless of who directed it, it feels like Stephen King. But in this case, since it was directed by John Carpenter, you get the feeling of his style as well. It legitimately feels like a combination of Stephen King and John Carpenter. So I think Christine is a good place for new horror fans to start, a good movie for new horror fans to check out. So that's my number one choice. My number two choice, and now we're getting into, we're no longer talking about like those people who have only seen a handful of horror movies. These are people who are, they're getting into the genre. They've checked out all the, the Freddy Kruegers and the Michael Myers and the Jason Voorheeses, and now they're looking for, where to go from there. So now I'm not holding back on recommending some movies with gore. I do think that Stephen King is a good place to start, so that's why my number two spot is also a Stephen King movie. Now don't worry, this is the last Stephen King movie I have here. And that movie is Pet Semetary. The main reason why I recommend Pet Semetary is for kind of nostalgic reasons. This was the first horror movie that I ever saw. Pet Semetary is the reason I got into horror. Yes, Halloween is my favorite horror movie of all time, but it would not be if I hadn't seen Pet Semetary. I remember it very well. I was 8 years old, and ever since I was a kid, I was always into horror. I read scary stories to tell in the dark, Goosebumps, I drew creepy pictures. My parents were really worried about me for a while. But anyway, whenever we would go to the rental store to rent movies, I would be in the horror section looking at the back of the boxes. And now, by the way, for the younger viewers, renting movies was an old custom that we used to do back in the day. We would go to these places called rental stores, and we would rent movies on these things called VHS tapes, and we would take them home and then we would bring them back. Yes, we had to drive to a building to rent movies. We couldn't just click a few buttons and give them our credit card information. Anyway, that was a little tangent. Back to Pet Semetary. The main reason, other than the nostalgic reasons, why I recommend Pet Semetary is because it shows you how unrelenting the genre can be. Because, and this is a minor spoiler if people have not seen it, but a baby gets killed in this movie, like a 2-year-old kid. And I remember being 8 years old, and I had seen, my dad let me rent Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, all that, Terminator, which is probably why I'm the well-rounded individual that you see before you. But anyway, so I thought I could handle, this stuff. But then I'm sitting there, and I'm seeing that kid going towards the road with that truck barreling down, and I'm not thinking, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. Oh God, they did it. And that really hit me in its, a kid was just killed. That kid just died. I could die any day now. So it really struck a chord with me. And the fact that they made a baby scary. Like, Gage scared the shit out of me when I was a kid. I was, like I said, I was 8 years old. My dad finally let my brother and me rent a horror movie. And it was a great idea because that entire night, we slept in bunk beds. I had the top bunk, and we went to bed at like 9 o'clock, and I was so terrified. I had to take a piss the entire night. I did not leave that bed. Pardon me, I'm thinking, I'm safe up here. Hopefully, baby Gage will not get me from up here. But, it was just, oh God, fond memories of childhood trauma. The atmosphere is perfect. It has some really scary moments, and even if there's somebody who is new to the genre, who hasn't seen the really scary shit, I think it's a good idea to have that movie, to have that film that scares the shit out of you, because you never forget your first genuine scare. And Pet Semetary was mine, and that's why I recommend that to new horror fans. Let's move on to the number 3 spot. And this one is mostly for those people who are up-and-coming slasher fanatics such as myself. You start off, they've seen, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Child's Play, hopefully Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And, then they want to branch out from those and check out other slasher films, going towards My Bloody Valentine or Prowler. And the one that I recommend, because of my love for exploitation movies and grindhouse cinema, the one I go for is Maniac. Yeah, technically it is more of a serial killer movie, but it has always been grouped in with the slasher genre. And that's why I like to recommend that to up-and-coming slasher fans. Because it shows you the other side of slasher films. You see the movie from the point of view of the slasher. The serial killer. Yeah, the serial killer movie. And I think Maniac does such a good job at playing on one of the scariest concepts. You don't know what people are like behind closed doors. I mean, that person that you've said hi to on the subway every day, he could go home and dress up in a chipmunk outfit. And then, start eating, aborted fetuses. Yeah, fine, I'm sick. Give me a break. But you see my point. And Maniac plays on that so well. We have Frank Zito, who is this man that is severely mentally disturbed. And we see him do all these horrible things and these great gore effects. I think this movie has Tom Savini's best work. This and Day of the Dead are some of his best effects work. But anyway, you have this man who is so sick, and we see him do these terrible things, and then we see him having conversations, like an average everyday person. Going on, you hear the clock? Anyway, moving on. You see him having conversations like a normal person. You see him going on dates. You see him being charming. And that, even though, yeah, those scenes can be considered kind of boring, but they're not, because we know what this guy's capable of, and we know that this is not him. He's able to blend in with normal society. And, these people who he's talking to, they don't know that he goes out on the street, murders women, and then scalps them. Yeah, so Maniac, that is a high recommendation for new horror fans, especially those who love slasher films. Okay, so number 4, Pirahna. Pirahna. And I'm talking the 1970s Pirahna, not Pirahna 3D, which I had a good time with. I did like that movie. But the original 1978 Pirahna, it shows how a horror movie can be scary and fun at the same time. And that's because of the quirky characters. One of the problems with modern-day horror movies, something that they're missing that the 70s and 80s horror movies had, quirky characters. I miss that. I miss having characters that were quirky, people that didn't mind joking back and forth. I would say something ridiculous. Like a perfect example, like the main character, the hero and the main actress, they're being held captive by the army and they're trying to sneak out. So the main character says, here, go distract that guy. And she asks, what if he's gay? He says, then I'll distract him. It's just these little funny moments. It's a good combination. It's a horror movie first, but it has these funny moments, and I miss that in a lot of modern horror movies. I miss the quirky characters. And also, I recommend Pirahna because I hear so many people talk about, I respect when a horror movie can kill a kid, and you don't see that. You don't see a lot of horror movies that have the balls to kill a kid. Yes, I have, and Pirahna is one of them. The first bloodbath in this movie is at a children's summer camp. Yeah, the first bloodbath is a bunch of children. And I want to make it clear, I'm not just sitting in my chair watching a movie hoping for some kid death. But yeah, you do respect a movie that can have the balls to kill off a child. Call me a sick fuck, call me whatever you want, I know. Anyway, so yeah, so Pirahna, the creature effects are great. They have this kind of charm to them, that old school 70s charm to them. The kills are fantastic, and like I said, it has the perfect amount of humor, but a lot more suspense. So yeah, it's like a perfect horror movie with humor sprinkled into it, in my opinion. So I like to recommend that movie. And I'm a 70s guy, I always have to recommend a horror movie from the 70s. So, moving on to number 5. I like to recommend at least one black and white horror movie. Not one from the 60s. Something pre-Psycho. Especially with people nowadays, especially with, movie fans nowadays, they don't give respect to black and white horror. They instantly think, oh, black and white, that's going to be boring. And they're missing out on so many movies, especially because a lot of black and white horror movies, they knew when to end. They weren't afraid to be under 80 minutes. There were a lot that were like 70 minutes or just an hour, especially from the 30s. And so, I want to recommend one black and white horror movie, and the black and white horror movie I usually recommend, it has to be one of the classic Universal monster movies. And I know I just said, I don't recommend the major classics, but people don't give respect to the 1930s classics like they should. And so, the classic Universal monster movie that I like to recommend to people is The Invisible Man. Because The Invisible Man is, I think, the most fun of all those movies. One, because of how they were able to do it, They made this guy invisible, and they didn't use any CGI. It was all camera trickery, lighting, and these really old-school effects. Which were stepping stones for movies to come. And not only that, you had a lot of great gags, like, the Invisible Man stealing somebody's bike, wearing just the pants and chasing after a woman skipping down the road. It did have some funny moments. And it's one of the first horror movies, it's one of the first movies where the villain is the main character. Before this, you didn't really have a main character who was the villain. And he's also funny and kinda likable. He's an asshole, but you can't help but like him. You always have the two main sides of a villain. You have the one that's chaos and disorder, and you have the one that's, calm, collected, and on the side of order. You have order like Darth Vader, and then you have chaos like the Joker. And I like to think you wouldn't have the Joker if it weren't for the Invisible Man. Because the Invisible Man was really the first villain of chaos, on that side of chaos and disorder. So because of all the combination of all that, the humor, the fact that the Invisible Man cracks jokes, the fact that you have all these fun gags, it's one of the more entertaining black and white horror movies, so I think it's a good one for new horror fans to start out with, so they can see how entertaining a black and white horror movie can be. So that's number 5, so we only have 5 more left here. At number 6, since I recommended an older movie, I might as well recommend a newer movie. And so, this is one that came out post-2010. And I like recommending this to people, so they understand what kind of movies I like. I like to support the independent horror movies. Not just independent horror movies, but the really low-budget to no-budget independent horror movies. I defend movies like Terrifier and Gutterballs. Don't worry, it's not Terrifier or Gutterballs, but I was tempted to put one of them on here. But there was one that came out in 2011 that ever since I saw it, I started recommending it to other horror fans, especially those who wanted to see some of the, the lesser-known stuff, the lower-budget ones. And that movie is Father's Day. And the reason I highly recommend Father's Day, I think it's a good movie to show that just because a movie has little to no budget doesn't mean there's not effort put into it. Because Father's Day, you watch the movie, Father's Day was only made for $10,000. $10,000 is still a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to, a lot of these other movies. Sometimes the cheapest movie that you find today was made for, $2 million, or $1 million, or at the very least $50,000. But this was made for $10,000, and it looks really good. And you can see the effort put into it. The movie is a spoof of exploitation cinema, of grindhouse movies. So of course, I'm gonna love it because I'm a grindhouse guy. But what really makes it so good is that, yes, it's a spoof, but you can tell that they're celebrating exploitation cinema as much as they're making fun of it. And I love that. I love that, that just because you're making fun of something doesn't mean you don't love it. And it's one of the best exploitation throwbacks that I've seen. I think it's better than Hobo with a Shotgun. Don't shoot me. Watch the movie first, then you can shoot me. It's definitely a little more on the extreme side, something along the lines of I Spit on Your Grave in many ways. It's about this guy who's hunting down this serial killer. He's trying to get revenge on the serial killer who rapes and murders fathers. And I kind of respect this movie because most horror movies, when they involve the concept of rape, it's viewed as something that happens to women. I mean, which is not true. I mean, in real life, rape can happen to anyone of any gender and any age. But most of the time in movies, women are the ones who have to experience sexual assault. And here's a movie that says, hey, we're going to go the other way with that. We're going to show the other side of sexual assault. Admittedly, they're just doing it to be shocking. But still, they're still showing the other side of that. Yeah, I don't think that this movie is being deep. No, it is trying to be a sleazy exploitation film. But it's also a spoof, and it's a great horror comedy because there are moments where I'm completely just disturbed by stuff that's happening on screen, and then I'm laughing at the next scene. It is really good, especially if, you want to get into the lower budget, lesser known lower budget horror movies, like the no budget horror movies. So I like to recommend that to people. It was a big inspiration to me to start trying to make my own stuff. That's why I made Enjoy, because I saw Father's Day and I thought, oh God, if they can do that, I can do it too. So I love to support Father's Day. Anyway, for the next two spots, number 7, I'm an Italian horror fanatic, so I had to recommend some Italian horror movies. So for the 7 and 8 spot, I've got 2 Italian horror movies here. So for the first Italian horror movie that I like to recommend when somebody wants to get into the Italian horror films, the main one that comes to mind is Lucio Fulci's Zombie. Now, I know I could have recommended Suspiria, and Suspiria is great, but I don't think, as great a movie as Suspiria is, I don't know if it's pardon me, so sorry. I don't know if it's a good horror movie for new horror fans. They have to, it is great. I do think it is kind of a good introduction to Italian horror, but I think Zombie is the better introduction to Italian horror. And I say that because it's a perfect example of what Italian exploitation is. It's a perfect example of Italian exploitation. The dangerous stunts. You have the scene where a guy in full zombie garb fights a tiger shark, and he's fighting a real tiger shark, and he's in full zombie garb under the water with no breathing apparatus. So you have the crazy stunts. You have the fantastic gore scenes. You have the nudity, which they're not afraid to hold back on. And the main thing, it looks pretty. It is pretty looking in certain points. It's beautiful looking in certain points. Nowhere near the levels of Suspiria or Blood and Black Lace, but it is something that's very common in Italian horror movies, how pretty they look. This one is probably the lower side of the pretty, but still, there are scenes where it's really good looking, especially the underwater sequences. Most people, when they're getting into horror, they've probably seen the George Romero movies, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. So this is a good one to go to after those movies. Also Return of the Living Dead, but I'm not getting into that right now. Zombie has the atmosphere, it has the gore, it has that grittiness that you get in exploitation cinema. I just love recommending that to people, especially people who want to get into Italian horror movies. That is a high recommendation for Italian horror virgins. Sorry, that was stupid. Anyway, and then the second Italian horror movie I have on this list, number 8, I have to recommend a giallo movie. Because being an Italian horror fan, giallo cinema is one of the biggest genres in Italian horror, in Italian exploitation in general. And so when recommending a giallo movie, as tempted as I am to recommend an Argento flick, the one I go for is my favorite giallo movie, Torso. I've already done a review on that, so I'll try not to spend too much time on it, but Torso is a perfect example of a giallo movie. You have the strange masked killer. You have the leather gloves. And it's strange because the kills themselves aren't that violent. The violence happens afterwards. The killer mutilates the bodies after he murders these people. The kills are done with something pretty, going back to the Italian horror movies being pretty. The kills are done with this pretty red scarf. So it's like a contrast. Here's this terrible thing happening, but it's being done with something that looks so nice. So it's an interesting contrast. It's different from the typical the knives cutting, the blood splattering all over the place. But you still get the blood, you just get it after the people are already dead, because he likes to mutilate the bodies afterwards. And again, the movie is so nice looking. I mean, this is such a good looking... I would put Torso in the top 5 prettiest Italian horror films. Maybe not, in the number 3 spot after Suspiria or Blood and Black Lace, but it is at least number 5. The music is great. Again, people just getting into horror probably have seen Halloween, and Torso influenced Halloween. It influenced Black Christmas, which came before Halloween. So I always think Torso is a good movie for people to check out, especially for new horror fans, and especially new horror fans that are getting into Italian horror. Love Torso so much. And we got 2 more movies on this list. In the number 9 spot, I wanted to put a 90s horror movie on here, because I grew up in the 90s, so might as well put some. There was not a lot. There were some great horror movies in the 90s, but not a ton. Nowhere near the amount that came out in decades before. And there's one Italian horror movie that is not talked about nearly enough. And that is Wes Craven's The People Under the Stairs. I love recommending that to new horror fans because it's one of the best horror comedies. It's so much fun, and it's just such a blast to watch. It has the gore in it, but the humor balances it out so well that I think brand new horror fans can handle it as well. The main character as a kid, the main character who was a kid helps, the younger horror fans identify with them, because the main character's name is Fool, and he's turning 13 years old, and they're not afraid to put him in danger. You think, yeah, this kid could die at any time. This kid puts the Goonies to shame, and how badass this kid is, and how brave he is, and what he's doing. And it has those funny moments, it has the funny lines, there's that scene where the kid's being attacked by by this guard dog, and his name's Fool. The kid's name is Fool, the main character. Fool and this other guy he's with, they're being attacked by this dog. And Fool, to try to distract the dog, yells, "Hey, Fuzzball, your mama sleeps with cats!" It's such a funny line. I love that line. But again, you have the suspense. The majority of this movie takes place in this one house. It's kind of like the movie The Collector. If you've seen the movie Collector, it's the same premise. It's a home invasion movie, but the person invading the house comes across a horror movie. You know, it's the person when they break into the house, it's the people inside the house who are crazy. So yeah, that's what it's like. It's like a normal person who just doing something completely unrelated to the horror walks into a horror movie already in progress. But yeah, because of the humor, because it's such a great movie by Wes Craven, rest in peace. Everybody talks about Scream, everybody talks about Nightmare on Elm Street, everybody talks about Last House on the Left. But my two favorite Wes Craven movies are The Hills Have Eyes and The People Under the Stairs. Anybody new to the genre will love it. I mean, I think that People Under the Stairs is a good gateway movie into Wes Craven's movies, even though they've probably already seen Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street. Once they've watched Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street, the first one I would hand to them next is People Under the Stairs. And that brings us to our last movie. I wanted to end this list with a movie that I recommend, which is so my tastes. Because if you've been on my channel, you know I'm an exploitation film guy. I love horror movies. And like I said, I love supporting the lower budget movies. And I wanted to support a movie from a director that inspired me a lot. You know, like I made my horror movie Enjoy, and I posted it here on my channel, and I was inspired to do it and by, you know, these lower budget directors, people like John Waters, and this guy here, Frank Henenlotter. Thanks to people like Frank Henenlotter, John Waters, and the Astron 6 guys, they're the ones who did Father's Day. They're the ones that convinced me I can do that. I can make those movies. And because of that, I made Enjoy, and I'm working on the script for my next project. I'm almost done with it, but I gotta finish the script first, and then hopefully I can start. Anyway, sorry, moving on. Frank Henenlotter is one of my biggest influences when it comes to no-budget filmmaking, because that's what he is. He had very little money. He had little to no money, and he made movies anyway. Same thing with John Waters. These are guys that had no money, but they said, hey, we're gonna make our own movies, regardless of the fact that we had no money. And when you watch a Frank Henenlotter movie, there's nothing else like a Frank Henenlotter movie. They're so different. And that's why I like to turn people on to these independent directors like Frank Henenlotter, because their movies are so unique from the mainstream. And the one I chose to the one that I choose to recommend to new horror fans is Frankenhooker. Frankenhooker, and I mean, I love Frankenhooker. I love the Basket Case series. I love Brain Damage. But Frankenhooker is the movie I like to recommend to people. Because it's so sleazy. It's so over the top. It's so ridiculous. And it knows that. It knows how goofy it is, and it embraces that. It's a movie, Frankenhooker is basically a Frankenstein story, obviously. About, you know, this guy, he accidentally kills his girlfriend with a automatic lawnmower. And all he has left is her head and a couple other parts of her body. So he goes out to collect body parts from hookers so he can piece her back together and make the perfect girlfriend. It's ridiculous, I know, and that's why it's so great. And even though it is another Frankenstein story, it's such a unique movie, and it's so different from so many other horror movies. It's a perfect example of why I love Frank Henenlotter. Because he has the balls to say, hey, I don't have any money, but I'm going to make movies that are more original than half the movies that you've seen. It's just, you have a scene where a bunch of hookers explode. How can you not want to see this movie after hearing that? And it's not done in a bloody, graphic way. The way it's done, you're laughing your ass off, and you're supposed to laugh your ass off. Henenlotter knows how ridiculous his movies are, and he loves that. He comes forth and says, I'm an exploitation movie director. That's what I am. He knows that his movies are just entertainment, and that's why I respect him so much. The whole thing, the reason he's making, the main character can only bring women back from the dead because its experiments are estrogen-based, or something along those lines. It's so ridiculous. And yeah, it's kind of sexist in a way, but not in a way that's trying to be mean or demeaning or anything. It's just kind of the way the story goes. I can recommend it to anybody. Man, woman, anything in between. You will have such a good time with this movie. Bill Murray loves this movie. There's a quote on the cover that says, if you watch one movie, watch Frankenhooker, and it's from Bill Murray. That is the highest recommendation I can give to this movie. It's the sleaze factor of it, the fact that all the actors, you can tell they're kind of in on the joke. They know that this is just a ridiculous movie, and you can tell they're having fun with it, but they're still doing it seriously. You can see the effort on screen. I would recommend any movie by Frank Henenlotter, whether it be Brain Damage or Basket Case. The Basket Case 2 and 3 are also great, but the first Basket Case, that's the one to go with. But I would say any new horror fan should start with Frankenhooker, just to see, where the horror genre can take you. Anyway, I know this was kind of rambly and stuttery. Again, like I said, I wrote these movies down so I'd remember them, and I just started filming. But yes, these are the movies that come to mind when I recommend horror movies to new horror fans. Now I'd like to hear from you guys. What are some horror movies that you recommend to new horror fans? And anybody who has a YouTube channel, if you have a YouTube channel, make a video. Make a video of your 10 movies that you recommend to new horror fans. Leave a comment down below with a link to that video. I give you full permission to promote your stuff down here below in this video. So if anybody sees somebody leaving a link, go check out that link because I give full permission for them to do that. Okay? So yes, please anybody, any YouTuber out there, either list them down below or make a video of horror movies that you recommend to new horror fans. I'm legitimately curious. I think this would be a lot of fun. So thank you for watching this less polished video of mine. I hope you had a good time. And, this is your buddy Justin here to remind you that the Grindhouse will never die.